From being super bad at striking to not paying attention to their footwork, MMA fighters are almost never good at boxing. But why is that? Well, sit back and relax as I explain. In the past few years, you might have noticed MMA fighters have tried their luck in boxing way more than ever. And honestly, it looks like it all started because Conor McGregor and Floyd Mayweather decided to get into a boxing match. But with that, there was another big misconception that developed among MMA fans. That is, they were convinced that MMA fighters are good at boxing, which they mostly are not. It's because these fighters train for different areas of fighting. Basically, according to critics, the reason they aren't good at boxing is because they can't focus only on boxing training. Since they learn several different fighting skills at one time, their attention is divided when they train for different things. All of this includes jiu-jitsu, Muay Thai, wrestling, and yes, boxing too. Ultimately, boxing isn't their best skill, but this might not be too easy for everyone to understand. So let's take a closer look and understand why exactly these fighters are bad at boxing. Some of you will say that both boxing and MMA are all about fighting, so there shouldn't be some big issue. Well, here's my take. MMA fighters, or even the UFC fighters, can't really compete against high-level boxers. In fact, they'll lose. Not just that, but it's also very much possible that they'll get outclassed or knocked out. Some people also argue that this makes MMA fighters entirely unskilled in terms of boxing. Well, that's not the case either, since they do have a level of expertise. They train for striking, or what the average person would refer to as boxing. But as I said earlier, they also train for takedown defense, kickboxing, and other stuff. When someone trains in MMA, not a single art of fighting can be neglected. But boxers, on the other hand, only need to focus on one thing: their hands. All they need to be attentive to is one form of art, and that is boxing. From the amateur training to their professional career, everything revolves around boxing only. So yeah, they're bound to be good at that. But this raises a question about the MMA fighters who have a boxing base. Are they also bad at boxing? Honestly speaking, yes they are. It'd be correct to say that even having the base training for boxing doesn't really help you in the ring. There are several fighters who moved from boxing to the world of MMA, including Ray Mercer and Holly Holm. Yes, they might be a bit better at boxing compared to other MMA fighters, but even these fighters can't compete against high-level boxers. One thing the observers state is that MMA fighters get really accustomed to the use of their other body parts. Have you seen them fighting? They go on to use their elbows, legs, and knees during bouts, so it's hard for them to leave it all. In boxing, you can't be using all of that, right? When MMA fighters transition to boxing, it's like exchanging an entire arsenal of weapons for a penknife. Not just that, but this also makes them lose the stance and other strategies they use while fighting. But then again, there are some MMA fighters, like Khabib Nurmagomedov, who can possibly win a boxing match quite decently.
The speed on that double leg is just incredible. Not sure what cut Poirier, but that is a significant cut, and bothering him, no fun. Unless your team Nurmagomedov and most people in this arena are, he'll try to drag Poirier down again.
The reason for that is these fighters are great at grappling and wrestling, so the opponents often try to avoid the defending takedowns. But when there's no takedown threat, the opponent has nothing to fear, really, and they might end up winning against Khabib too. With that said, the reasons don't end here. Apparently, the footwork has a lot to do with this matter as well. In boxing, footwork is one of the most critical components, and boxers practice hard for that. This is because, while boxing, the fighters are required to stay stable and hold their stance, but at the same time, they also need to move around. This ultimately requires agility, coordination, and an understanding of footwork.
Easy. Like salsa. I gotta change it now.
And for those who don't know, there are several types of footwork. It could be the pivot or the step and slide. Each kind has its own specifics and purpose. and the boxers know it all. But when an MMA fighter is asked to box, they're usually not too good at the footwork. Why? Well, because it isn't their focus. In mixed martial arts, there are kicks and grappling techniques, so they don't need this kind of footwork at all. But this makes me wonder if MMA fighters are good at punching at least. Well, you'd be surprised to know the answer. The thing about MMA is that there are many more knockouts in it than there are in boxing. This often leads fans to think that MMA fighters can punch much harder compared to boxers, but apparently that's not necessarily the case. MMA fighters use 4-ounce gloves, which means that the fighters generate more power with the shots, and that ultimately causes more knockouts. But in boxing, the gloves used are around 10 to 12 ounces, so that means the fighters need more natural power for knockouts. The timing of the shot also matters, but still, it won't be entirely correct to say that MMA fighters can punch harder than boxers. The differences are there, but what if a boxer turns to MMA? Would it be a better idea? Over the years, many boxers have transitioned to MMA and vice versa. In fact, some even changed their entire career path by doing so. For example, Holly Holm, who I mentioned earlier, she was a boxer when she started her career, but later transitioned to MMA fighting. Heather Hardy also transitioned from boxing to MMA. However, fans haven't seen Hardy for a while Holmes is actually quite active right now. I can't say it's a better idea because it depends on the one transitioning.
That looked like it was off the hand, but some of it clipped her, I think.
I think it sounded louder than it really was. Didn't do much to hurt Jones. Oh, but that one does! It is all over! Holly Holm with the brutal...
Does the training suit them? Can they go for several arts at one time? These are questions that only the fighter can answer. But an even more important question is, why are MMA fighters making such a massive switch? I mean, why do they feel the need to transition to boxing? As I said earlier, it's kind of become a trend that MMA fighters have been wanting to compete in boxing. One example is Kamaru Usman, who's been campaigning for a fight against Canelo Alvarez. What I know so far is that these high-profile boxing matches have a fat purse almost every time, especially when compared to high-profile MMA fights. The pay scale is quite different. When high-level boxers face low-level MMA fighters, they can easily earn millions of dollars in one go, and this can put them in the highest-paid fighters list. McGregor also earned quite a lot of money when he fought against Khabib. Apparently, the base pay for him was $3 million, and the bonuses, sponsorships, and pay-per-view aren't included in this. Imagine getting paid such an insane amount for one fight. Not to mention, Alvarez had also received a whopping $15 million since it was the guaranteed purse. But reports also state a cap of $40 million that he received along with the fixed pay for his fight against Dimitri Bivol. Looking at all this money, it's quite clear why most MMA fighters wish to compete in boxing. Even when they have little chance of winning, they just simply want to be there. But at the same time, there are some who just like to do that. And this is all about why MMA fighters are bad at boxing.